Chilling tale from the haunted museum, Paranormal Activity Exposed. I took the job because the museum wouldn't pay for a full crew. One night, after closing, the director had said over the phone, her voice the hard, bright edge of someone used to asking for more than she should. "We need B-roll for the site. Walkthroughs, close-ups of the exhibits, some atmospheric shots. No on-camera talent. Just you, your gear, and the hush of history." Hush of history. It sounded like a pitch line, something you'd stencil over a lobby wall in tasteful serif. But the money was decent, and I liked museums. Even when I was a kid, I preferred glass cases to carousels, buttons you weren't supposed to press, drawers you weren't supposed to open. The museum here lived in a reworked train depot, long, brick-ribbed halls, and a clock that no longer told time. Its banners flapped in a crosswind as I parked, the fabric snapping like a tired flag. The security guard who let me in, Manny, according to his tag, did that thing where you smile without your teeth. "You're the cameraman," he said. "Just me," I said, and lifted the case to prove it. He glanced at the hall behind him. It was all dim except for green exit signs and small pools of light in the galleries, like islands glowing through fog. Somewhere a compressor hummed, a sound too steady and deep to be noticed unless you were alone. "Arms down, please." Manny Wan scanned me in my case. "It's an old building. Things click and settle. Don't let it get to you." "I won't," I said, and wondered why he'd said it. He signed me in with the old brass pen. "Lights are on motion sensors, most of them anyway. If something sounds like it's in the walls, it probably is. HVAC. If you hear footsteps upstairs, it's not me." He added that with the tight humor of someone who wanted it to be a joke. "If I hear footsteps upstairs, I'll run," I said. He held the door as it closed behind me, and the lock caught with a metallic kiss. The main hall was a spine with ribs of gallery space branching left and right. The floorboards had been salvaged from a shipyard. They kept their scars and their splinters and their long salt smell. The first gallery I came to was agriculture and industry, with an old apple sorter and a line of farm tools hung as if waiting for hands. I passed artifacts of daily life, children's shoes, a tin of cough lozenges, an infant's woolen bonnet with a label that said, "Possibly acquired from a family on Mason Street, 1907. The photos were sepia and stiff-backed, the faces unwilling to soften. I set up in the natural history room because I figured the taxidermied bobcat would play well in a cold open. I put the slider on the floor and mounted the camera. The bobcat's pupils were hand-painted, flecks of gold bright enough to fool you. Behind it, a mural showed pines, a gray sky, and a suggestion of hill country. The air smelled like dust and old paper, and there was a thin sweetness to it, the way old wood sometimes smells when you cut into it. I did a slow introductory sweep, the bobcat to the case of birds, waxwings, and a heron, and then past a display of shells where a polished conch flared like a horn. The sound of my shoes on the floor turned into a metronome. The camera took in more light than my eyes did, and the monitor brightened the room in that way screens have, suggesting safety through the idea of attention. That's when the audio guide clicked. It was the kind that was a handset on a coiled cord. They were mounted throughout, each resting in a cradle below a small brass plaque. The one nearest me woke with a hollow pop. No motion sensor, no hand on it. A tone, and then a woman's voice. No accent, museum neutral, spoke. "In this case," she said softly, "you'll find specimens acquired between 1898 and 1923. Please note the catalog numbers on the display cards." I listened. My recorder was rolling. The information was what you'd expect: provenance, preservation, the civic pride of an institution in love with its own endurance. But on the last sentence, the voice changed. It wasn't distorted so much as aware. "Please note the catalog numbers on the display cards," it repeated, and the faintest exhale followed. I checked the card under the bobcat, C19042. The birds, C16011 through C16018. The conch, C12003. I don't know why I said the numbers out loud. Maybe because the woman's voice had said to, and maybe because that's what museums train you to do. Observe, recite, repeat. My breath fogged the glass, thin and immediate. When it cleared, the reflection gave me back a shape that wasn't me. It was just a smear, a suggestion of a figure moving across the opposite gallery's doorway. A whisper of fabric, the white of a sleeve. I turned. The doorway was empty. The motion sensor light made a show of waking. Bright, then bright again. The audio handset clicked back into silence. The compressor hummed. My heart started up its rabbit drumming. "Manny," I called, stupidly. The building gave one of those shifts you can feel in your feet, a stutter of wood that tells you it is settling into its memory of how to be a house. I kept working. That's the thing about being alone with a camera. You learn to file fear into a shoebox and slide it under a bed so it won't trip you. In the transport gallery, a handcar sat on a short length of track, the handles upright like a prayer. I got a tight shot of the iron bolts, a slow pull from the engraved maker's plate to the worn wood. In the corner, a mannequin in a conductor's coat held a pocket watch. I took in his face last. The paint was too good. It had the old-world polish of someone who once painted saints and then had to pivot to livelihoods. The eyes tipped down, just shy of meeting yours. "Don't do that," I said to the mannequin, and laughed to prove to myself I could. I had 3 minutes of the conductor framed when his pocket watch clicked. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. A catch, a leap, a tick that arrived like a thought. I stepped close and listened. Nothing. When I lifted the camera, the watch was tucked into his waistcoat. It had been out. I knew it. The chain lay in a new arc. My recording would show it one way, and then the other, if I checked, if I wanted to make it be a problem. In the children's gallery, a schoolroom had been recreated with slate boards and a bell, the desks tidy as teeth. Chalk words still clung to the board from the last field trip. Be kind. Wash hands. Do your best. A row of little red jackets on pegs looked like a string of flags. Something in the far corner smelled damp. When I stepped that way, the smell faded. When I stooped, because I thought I saw a marble under a desk, someone ran down the hall outside the gallery, feet light, feet small. I straightened. Silence. Then in the next gallery over, furniture and fabrication, one chair scraped itself a careful inch over the floor. It was there, in the schoolroom, where the labels began to change. I noticed it because I'm a detail person. On the drinking fountain exhibit, the placard read, "City Fountain Talavan, Brass, donated by Emma T. Willoughby." Below it, in tiny print, where donors are thanked and curators credited, another line had appeared in a lighter ink, as if it had just dried. Recorded by Martin Hale. That's my name. I stepped closer. The ink had that slightly raised feel when it catches the light. The font matched. It wasn't a sticker, it was printed. The margins were perfect. I checked other labels. On the apple sorter, shot by M. Hale. On the conch, video record, M. Hale. On the mannequin's pocket watch, time logged 21:06. It was a joke, it had to be. Manny? A staffer still lingering with a label maker? The more I looked, the more I saw it, the way you see your name in a crowded page of text and nothing else. When I made for the security desk, my shoes clicked in that too loud way that makes you want to tiptoe. The desk was empty. The monitors, a neat grid, showed the galleries in grainy black and white. In one, I saw myself entering the transport gallery, lifting the camera, setting it on the case. In another, I saw the children's gallery. The jackets on the pegs stirred against a wind that wasn't there. In the bottom left feed, the main hall's long perspective held a figure standing about halfway down, turned toward me. Dark suit, white gloves. I put my finger on the screen and left a print. The figure did not move. "Manny," I said again, my voice thinned before it reached the ceiling. The camera bag was heavier now. The walk back to natural history felt longer, as if the hall had grown ribs. In the bird case, condensation latticed the inside of the glass. Each exhale seemed to write something. I wiped at it with a sleeve. A shape stood on the other side, closer than the birds, a suggestion of a human chest and the triangle of a tie. The glass cleared, and I saw only my face, pulled tight across my skull, eyes too wide. The audio guide woke again. "Notice how the collection is arranged," the woman's voice said. "History is not a straight line. It is a room built from rooms. Each door is also a frame." The air pressure shifted the way it does before an airplane lands. In the reflective glass, I watched the exit sign's glow step down, and the ambient hum adjusted into a lower syllable, like a throat clearing. That was when an unseen door somewhere opened and closed in 2 neat beats. The sound walked across the galleries, through the walls, as if the building's bones were being quietly tuned. I became aware of the catalog in my hand before I realized I had it. It was a leather book with a green ribbon. I hadn't taken it from anywhere. It was simply with me, the way a thought sometimes is suddenly in your mouth. The cover was worn to the suede in places. Inside, the pages had lines and columns and the soft stains of fingers, the names, the dates, the accession numbers, objects described with the kindness of precision. C19042, bobcat, taxidermy. C16011 through C16018, birds. On the most recent page, the ink was wet. I held the book away from my shirt, breath held. The entry was still uncurling across the paper, careful, patient. C25081, the witness, media, flesh, voice, digital record. Acquired August 21st, donor, N.A. Collected by curator. Below that, my name. I didn't throw the book. I didn't scream. All my fear became a blade that cut me into motion. I went for the closest door, curatorial office, private, because if there was a joke, if there was a prank, that was where it would sit smiling. The lock turned in my hand. I felt the building disagree with me, a small tremor through the jamb as if a muscle flexed. The office was neat in a way that felt rehearsed. A desk with a blotter, a lamp shaped like a bronze leaf, shelves full of boxes labeled in that small, perfect handwriting every archivist seems to share. On the wall was a frame with no picture in it. The space where the image should have been was clean, pale, empty. My blank reflection hung there, unsure of its outline. On the desk sat a label maker. The tape fed through already had something printed on it. I touched the end, and it recoiled slightly, as if it were breathing. The witness, Mhale, exhibit temporary until further notice. The word temporary stung. It suggested a schedule. It suggested someone had a plan. There are ways to stop a museum cold. Fire alarm, sprinklers, power. The fire panel was under a plexi cover near the security desk. I had a pocket knife. I cracked the cover, and the alarm snarled to life, a howl that turned the air into knives. Red strobes started their angry blinking. Sorry, I said out loud to a building that had probably survived worse. The suppression system engaged with a noise like a sigh being reversed. Pressurization, a rush of something I didn't want in my lungs. Not water, not foam. The air went dry and white at the edges. The labels on the cases, the tidy little rectangles, darkened. Ink bled. Letters softened into unreadable curls. The audio guide fought against the alarm. Please remain, remain, remain. The scream of the system shook dust from the rafters. Something moved fast in the confusion. Through a doorway, around a corner, the whiteness at its shoulders as unreal as surf. It stopped at the edge of my sight, at the edge of the transport gallery, and turned its palms outward as if to show me its gloves were clean. White gloves. The figure from the monitor. The curator with a capital letter that arrived in my head and planted itself. It didn't come toward me. It pointed. To the desk. To the label maker. To the strip of printed tape. Then to my chest. No, I shook my head. No. The alarm tried to make my no into a stuttered chirp. I slammed the label maker's back open. Inside, a cartridge of museum-approved tape gleamed. Another cartridge sat beside it, marked Loan, Temp, Travel in neat pen. My hands moved without asking me for permission, a trembling quickness I would later tell myself came from adrenaline, not instruction. I slammed the Loan cartridge home and typed with 2 fingers, the keys too small, the screen too slow. On loan, not yet cataloged. I printed. The tape fed out with a measured chew. My hands were so unsteady I almost tore it crooked. The curator watched from the doorway, head tilted in a curiosity that felt like pity. On loan, I said loudly, and slapped the label to the front of my jacket, right over my racing sternum. Not accessioned, not yours. The building reacted the way a sleeping animal does when its dream changes. The alarm continued, but the air shifted into a less hostile shape. The white hiss softened. The lights flickered to day for a single breath and then returned to their triangles of emergency glow. In galleries up and down the hall, I heard the sound of settling, of little clicks and sighs, like glass making its peace with itself. The curator lowered its hands. The gloves were not fabric, but the idea of fabric, a perfect fit over nothing at all. The empty frame in the office showed not my reflection, but a smear of light, and in that smear for a second, a face that could have been mine and could have been anyone. The catalog in my hand shut itself with a thud that echoed inside me. When I opened it again, the most recent line had taken on a shaky strike-through. C25081, the witness, deferred. Flesh, voice, digital record. Status on loan. The alarm finally cut, a guillotine drop of sound that let my ears flood back. In the sudden quiet, the sprinkler pipes ticked as they thought better of it. The audio guide handset, somewhere down the hall, righted itself with a small apologetic click. I walked out with the label still on my chest. Manny was at the front, holding the door hard against its own desire to stay shut. He didn't ask. He didn't even take my name badge. He only looked at the label, and then at me, and something like respect or fear showed up in his eyes. "Back tomorrow?" he asked. "No," I said, and the night breathed me out of the building. At home, I put the equipment on the kitchen table and sat on the floor, because chairs felt too curated. I peeled the on-loan label off my jacket. It resisted. Underneath, the skin was red in the shape of the letters, as if sunburn had memorized the words. I peeled slower. It hurt worse. When the tape finally came free, the adhesive had left a faint line where a date should have been. I slept with the label on the bedside table. I dreamed of glass, of frames, of the way a room looks at you when it has decided you are part of it. In the morning, today, I opened the museum's website out of a masochistic urge to prove it had all been in my head. A new banner spun across the top, featured exhibit, community stories. The photo below it wasn't a photo, it was a reflection, a pane of glass with my camera in it, my shoulders sloped, my eyes small with tiredness. I hadn't taken that shot. I couldn't have. No credit line, no name. But the caption underneath read, in the sparse grammar of cataloging, C25081, The Witness, on loan. Local videographer, details pending. See in person. I closed the laptop and put my hands flat on it, as if I could press the image back into the screen until it gave. There is a sound that a building makes when you are alone, a tiny, arrhythmic clicking as it thinks. I hear it now, though I am not in the museum. It is in my walls, where the radiator pipes travel. It is in the trim around my door, where a carpenter's nail is a small, dark eye. It is in the frame of my bathroom mirror, which this morning showed a smudge that wouldn't wipe, as if something had leaned in to see how my face was catalogued. I am on loan. That's what the label says, even now, when I hold it up to the light. There's a place at the end where a due date waits to be typed. If I rub it with my thumb, the adhesive grows warm, and for a breath I can see what might be a date there, trying to bulge into the world. It is not today. It is soon. I have the catalog still. I don't remember leaving with it, but here it is on my table, green ribbon, leather worn to the suede. The page with my struck-through entry resists my eye. Between one blink and the next, the line looks less struck through. The word deferred is a softer gray. The phrase temporary until further notice blooms in the margin like a watermark. Doors are frames. Frames are doors. The curator doesn't need to leave the museum to do its work. It only needs to name things correctly. It only needs to arrange them. I typed out another label just now, hands shaking so hard I had to backspace twice. On permanent loan. I don't know if that will help me or ruin me. I peeled the tape and felt the words cost me something as they left the machine. I pressed the tape to the catalog's cover like a spell, like a dare. The house clicked. The pipes laughed once, soft in the walls. There are rules to not being haunted. Don't invite. Don't name. Don't look too long into glass. The museum taught me a new one. Don't get cataloged. If you come to the depot, if you let the building take your measurement, if you press your breath to the glass and read the numbers on the cards, you will feel the hush of history lift like a lid, and beneath it, the even quieter hush of the thing that keeps the lids on. If I go back tonight, if I have to, because the label seems to want me to, maybe I'll bring a box of blank tags and cover every name I see until the building is nothing but unlabeled objects and me, a man who refuses to be sorted. Maybe that will make the curator furious. Maybe that's the point. Maybe fury is the only voice it hasn't used yet. For now, I am waiting in a room built from rooms. The glass of the window is breathing on the inside. Something on the other side is measuring the frame. The empty picture over my desk, which was not empty yesterday, has started to show, not a picture exactly, the suggestion of a coat, the careful shape of white gloves. On loan, I say into the room, a little louder than I need to. Not yet catalogued. The gloves hover at the edge of the glass, considering. Then, slowly, they open, ready to take me back. The road ends where the dunes begin, a ribbon of asphalt swallowed by sand and wind. When I kill the engine, the silence feels wrong, thick, as if the night has been padded. The facility sits crouched against the slope like something that grew here by accident. Concrete shoulders, a row of slit windows black with their own reflection, and a narrow door with 3 locks. Above it, a rusted placard reads, "Institute for Auditory Dynamics," the letters chewed by salt and time. I'm here because someone thought it would be easy money. A friend of a friend said they needed an overnight caretaker for a few weeks while the institute handed over archives to the university. Keep an eye on the place, sign for deliveries, make sure the copper doesn't walk away. It's just a bunker with dreams, he said, laughing. All the weird stuff is packed up. He didn't mention the way sound dies out here, or how the wind, once it finds the right corner, can cry like a living thing. My keys clatter against the door like teeth. When it opens, cool air strokes my face, smelling faintly of iron and paper. My footsteps go down a bare corridor, the walls poured smooth and curved on purpose. It was designed with no hard right angles, the friend said, to prevent standing waves. My phone's torch paints the walls with a moving moon. At each bend, the corridor seems to bend a little more. I find the switchboard and bring the building to life. Fluorescent lights chew into the darkness one by one, a slow procession. In the main hall, tiles checker the floor, a dull yellow and a duller gray. Boxed equipment waits in stacks, each crate marked with the name of a lab I imagine as a room full of attentive eyes. Psychoacoustics, low-frequency perception, the shadow chamber. I ignore that last one. The name snags, a burr I don't want to look at yet. The office they've given me is a leftover space with a desk, a kettle, and a window that looks out at a wall of sand held back by concrete and grass. There's a couch. I put my bag down, check the time, 21:12, and boil water for coffee. The kettle's tinny rumble is the first sound the place returns to me on purpose, and I feel the smallest relief. Even the lonely have habits. The first odd noise comes while I'm writing in the logbook. It's nothing, at first, the warble of the wind, transformed by a vent. But it pins a nerve. It sounds like a cried word turned inside out, a syllable folded into itself. I hold my breath. It comes again, thinner now, off to the left. I tell myself it's the wind sliding across the chimneys like a finger over a bottle. I re-wet my pen and make a note of it. This is what a responsible person does. They turn fear into ink. It would be easier if the building were silent. Instead, it's the curriculum of noise. Pipes seethe, ducks mutter. Somewhere a fan thinks about turning and changes its mind. Doors sigh in their frames as air pressure changes. I pretend I'm learning a language that will let me speak back to it. Around 10, I take a walk. The halls are longer now that they're lit, or perhaps they were always this long. Paint has bubbled where damp found a home. The soundproofing foam in some studios has dried to a brittle crust, like old bread. I pass a door halfway open and glance in. A narrow room with a microphone in a cage and a chair that seems to be listening to it. A frame in the corner holds a mess of copper wires wound into coils. The coils are dusted with fine black grit, as if they've been used to comb the night. The cry, if it is a cry, comes again while I'm peering into that room. 3 notes this time in a descending arc, and my ribs do a peculiar thing, a quick flex inward as if to protect my heart. It is not quite human, and not human, the way a baby's first attempts at words can be words if you need them to be. It seems to come from the far side of the hall, the room with the bolted door and the nameplate that makes my throat dry. Shadow chamber. I stand there longer than I should, doing the math of caution. It's probably a leaky seal in the HVAC, or a fox, or one of the building's experiments sleeping with a bad dream. I listen until the hair on my arms decides for me, and then I go back to the office and close the door with the care you give to small sick things. Calm returns like a cat that isn't yours. For 20 minutes there is the gentle labor of work, inventory lists, emails that begin with, "as per our last exchange." Outside, the wind goes to its next appointment. I even forget about the cry. When the bulb above my desk pops with a sound like a knuckle cracking, I jump and laugh at myself, and then I do not laugh because the ceiling fixture is glass, and inside its shadow there is another sound, a thin breathing. My own, of course, thrown back at me by the glass curve. I stand and replace the bulb with a spare I find in the drawer. My fingers touch the fixture, and in that moment something speaks near my ear, a soft syllable of air. Low? My brain starts to become someone else's brain. I screw the bulb home and light pours back, washing the office flat and harmless. In the silence that follows, the word, if that's what it was, folds back into nothing like a small animal into a hole. I decide to make tea instead of coffee. By midnight, the building has settled into itself. My phone shows 3 bars of reception and 0 messages. The dune outside the window is now a black wall wearing a fuzz of moving grass. When I crack the window open, cold air pushes in with intention, rubbing against the edges of the frame, testing them. The sea must be just beyond the next ridge. I can smell it, a salted damp that finds the inside of your nose and refuses to leave. I'm not thinking of anything when I hear it. A child, crying once and then not quite. It's the shape of a sob but empty in the center, like a pressed leaf. It hooks under the breastbone the way a few notes of a song from childhood will. I'm standing before I know it, and my mug tips. Tea sluices across the desk and drips on my shoes, a warm apology. I set the mug down carefully and say, "Hello?" Every hair in my ears leans forward. In the corridor, my steps sound too loud, as if I'm wearing someone else's shoes. I move toward the shadow chamber door because that is where the sound lives now, has always lived. The door is heavier than the others, its edge biting the floor at a slight angle so that it sighs and complains at once when opened. A light panel glows amber inside, and I hit the switch. The chamber is not large. It is larger than its size. The walls absorb my presence. Black foam in overlapping wedges swallows shape and shine, the room becoming a geometry of appetite. The floor is a grid of taut steel cables. No strings, I realize, thick as fingers, stretched over an empty subfloor so that any step would produce a note. But there is a narrow gangway of perforated metal along the wall, and I keep to it, pressing my palm into the cold to reassure myself the wall has limits. In the center of the chamber, a metal frame hangs by thin wires. Inside it is a sphere of microphones, each smaller than the nail of my thumb. At the far end, a speaker the size of a plate floats in its own web, a spider waiting for footfall. Sound here is an organ with 1,000 mouths. I don't step onto the strings, and yet the room seems to play anyway, a low chord, not heard so much as felt, as if the skin between bones were a membrane. It's not unpleasant. It's like the start of sleep. My eyes drift to a control panel near the gangway. A switch labeled Actuate Ambience has been taped over, the word Archive scrawled on the tape. I am not an idiot. I don't touch it. The cry comes again. It comes from everywhere, which is somehow worse than anywhere. It's quieter now, almost embarrassed, and it is very close to the first cry I remember making as a child when I thought my mother had left. I don't mean it resembles that cry. I mean it remembers it. "I hear you," I say, because that is what your mouth says when your bones are uncertain. My voice makes a small wall in the air and then dissolves. The speaker across the room coughs, just once, like a laugh with no humor, and then the room offers me my own voice back, not perfectly, smaller, like a seed of it. "I hear you," it says in my cadence, in my vowels, in the way my fatigue smears the R and eats the tail of the Y. I back out, my hand on the wall like a blind person counting bricks. I pull the heavy door closed and twist the lock, which feels performative and stupid, and then I set my forehead against the cool metal until it stops being an effort to stand. I sleep on the couch with the light on. Dreams knock once on my skull and then think better of it. When the wind finds a new corner around 3 a.m., it plays the building like a mouth harp. The notes stream variations of my name, which is not comforting. At 3:11 exactly, the tea kettle clicks, as if just finishing a boil, though the plug is not in the socket. From the hall, a paper skitters, stops, changes direction without turning over. My phone vibrates with a text that doesn't appear. When I get up to use the restroom, a shadow moves at the end of the corridor, not moving in the way shadows normally do. This one darts, checks, and then flattens as if ashamed to be seen. I stop, but my pulse has already decided to finish without me. It might be my reflection, I rationalize, in a glass panel. Except there is no glass at the end of that corridor. It terminates in a dead blank wall. I go anyway, because that is what you do. You go to prove to yourself you can. There's nothing at the wall. Of course there is nothing. But I feel some small temperature change touch my ankles, something sliding away under the crush of my attention, like a mouse leaving a room when you turn your head. The morning is slow light creeping over a sick day. I make coffee. The cry doesn't come. I write the night in the logbook and find a second logbook under the first, half full of cramped handwriting that isn't mine. Heard it again in the vents, it says on June 4th. Sounded like a man calling the dog, only we don't have a dog. An entry from July 11th is a map made of words. Left stare, cold patch by the extinguisher, 42 seconds, crying stops when you breathe out hard. The last entry, dated August 2nd, is short as a nail. It knows my name. I should leave. Even if it's just the wind and a nervous brain, I should leave because buildings built to study silence are places where silence picks up new hobbies. But the invoice needs hours attached to it, and I have never been good at admitting the smaller shapes of fear. I tell myself I will do one more night, just to prove that the first was an anomaly. People learn. Buildings just sit there. I can be the former. At dusk, the sea is louder, not because it's rough, but because my ears have been taught by the day. Every noise draws a line between this moment and something earlier. I find myself thinking about a field near a hedge where I once got lost for 10 minutes that felt like a wound. I can still hear my small voice calling from my knees. I haven't thought of that in years. At 22:17, the phone on the desk rings, even though the line is dead. I know it is dead because I tested it. When I pick up, breath flows on the other end, tinny through ancient wiring. It breathes in time with mine for a long moment. "Who is this?" I ask, and the line blinks with quiet. I put the phone down. The cry answers from the corridor. I don't run exactly. I move quickly in that way you move when you are already in the bad place, and running would merely stir the badness into a froth. The hall tilts me toward the shadow chamber door without asking. The lock turns too easily. The room drinks me again. This time, I step onto the strings. The note they make under my weight is thick and careful. A low E, my best guess. The part of my brain that knows how to tune a guitar nods in recognition and then panics at the recognition. The microphones in their floating sphere angle toward me with infinitesimal motor sounds, the attention of a flock of birds when you scatter grain. The speaker trembles an amount you can only see if you don't look directly at it. "Hello," I say, because that is what we do, not because it makes sense. The reply is my hello, pitched down, softened, as if wrapped in cloth. A third voice threads through, one I don't recognize. Not me, and not a child, but not a child either. It says a single syllable, "Lo," the end of hello, as if I had dropped the start of it in my rush to be heard. My breath shortens. The sound shortens with it, the way shadows do when you aim a light at them. The microphones, all those little hungry mouths, listen so hard I feel the heat of them, which is impossible. On the control panel, the tape half peeled up as if by a fingernail. The switch wait, actuate, learn winks. The Institute must have recorded hundreds of voices here, thousands, teaching the room not just to hear but to attend, to pull features out of noise like a face out of clouds. I imagine scientists saying, "We taught it to detect intention," and I almost laugh because I am an intention with legs. The true shape of the thing, not a ghost, not a wind, not a child, resolves with a small click inside me, like a cassette seating into place. This room has been trained to hear the human cry the way a lens is trained to focus. It remembers those cries. It learns to call back. The shadow chamber was designed to study what happens to sound when it's stripped of echo and comfort. The thing left in that absence is a shadow of a voice. The room has been feeding it for years. The hunger is not for noise, but for attention. We are animals that turn attention into shape. The room wants shape. It wants me. I take a step back and the strings sing that low E again, and the chamber answers with a harmonic that threads up the spine of my hearing and tightens there. "No," I tell the room, or the thing in it. "No." The speaker flexes. My own no whispers back to me, and under it the other voice, light as paper. "Oh." It is not trying to be a child. It is trying to keep me here by wearing the emptiest piece of my earliest fear. The thought comes from somewhere practical and mean in me. Starve it. Attention is food. The room is an addict for repetition. I can deny it. I can refuse to shape the air with what it wants. I step toward the control panel and flip the switch the tape was trying to keep me from, the one that opens a different mouth, ambience. The chamber exhales a full-spectrum hiss, white noise, the sound of every sound at once. The effect is immediate. The microphones flinch, their motors whirring as they try to track everything and therefore nothing. The speaker shivers and then smooths itself, a snake frustrated by sand instead of skin. My breath becomes a kind of invisibility cloak. In the wash of noise, it vanishes. The third cry rises, far off and thin now, like something in the next building over. It struggles to make a shape in the storm I've given it. I keep the switch pinned and glance around for a power kill. I don't see one. The hiss wraps the chamber like steam. The strings underfoot thrum. The room fights back the way a learned machine fights, by guessing what I will respond to. The hiss begins to form little notches, subtracting itself into patterns, carving a familiar valley in the soundscape. My name appears in the noise, my very name, the way a face appears if you stare at a TV's static long enough. The microphones tilt and sigh. The speaker makes a sound like stepping on snow, compressing the uncountable into something that holds you. I know what you are, I tell it, even though that's generous. I need the sentence to give my hands an order. I look up. Above the speaker, at the join of ceiling and wall, a cluster of cables meets a box the size of a shoebox, the place where the power for the array arcs and distributes itself. I'm not thinking about fire regulations when I grab the metal chair and swing it. The chair meets the box with a bad-handed clank. It doesn't break. Few things you swing at with desperation break on the first try. The noise whooshes out for a second as a relay trips and returns. I take 2 steps along the gangway, set my feet, and swing again. The second hit catches the corner and the casing gives like tooth enamel, a smell of hot dust and burned varnish blooms. The hiss becomes a dying breath and then a buried one. The microphones make jittery little complaint sounds and then go still. The strings hum to themselves and the hum runs down the ladder of notes to nothing. The silence is not pure. It is full of my heart. It is full of the after-image of sound. I put the chair down because my hands cannot hold it anymore without shaking a declaration I don't want to make. In the dead chamber, something small still moves, a soft clicking like a beetle in a matchbox. I stand very still and let my hearing pull the room apart. The clicking is not the room, it's me. My jaw, I realize, is trembling so hard my molars are chattering. Done, I say, and the room has nothing to say back. I lock the door behind me. I imagine the speaker in there continuing to contract, like a heart that has forgotten the trick of diastole. Back in the office, the kettle's plug sits on the counter where I left it. I plug it in and boil water on purpose. The whistle the kettle makes is stupidly human, a parlor trick of physics, and it makes me want to cry, but I don't. I make tea and drink it and watch the window turn into a mirror as the room gets light. I write the night carefully in the logbook. I don't write everything. I leave out the part where the room became a mouth. I leave out the part where the sound knew the exact center of me, or found something near the center and rang it like a glass. I do write, disabled the array due to unsafe autonomous activation. The sentence looks official, which is the point. I leave at midday, the dunes hot and the sea wearing a different color. My car smells like myself. As I drive away, the Institute leans back into the sand, a thing pretending to be a hill. For 20 kilometers, I do not turn on the radio. That night in my apartment, the world is still a machine of noise. The upstairs neighbor's deliberate feet, the refrigerator's throat clearing, a motorcycle announcing itself and then apologizing. I shower with the fan on and the water pressure making a sweet drum on the tile. When I turn the tap off, in the last few seconds of water dying, I hear it. It is quieter than it was and closer. It isn't a child's cry. It never was. It is the ghost of breath making a shape where breath should just be breath. Lo, it says, not quite. My own mouth almost answers because muscle remembers what mind refuses. I go very still and count to 60, the way you do when you've swallowed the wrong thing. The sound does not repeat. When I move again, every motion makes a little absence in the room that my hearing wants to fill with that shape. I don't let it. I move with the dullness of someone under a heavy blanket. In bed, I keep the same position for an hour so I won't learn the small noises of turning and begin to find meaning in them. Twice I start to say my own name in the dark, for no reason but the wish to be here and not there. And twice I stop with my tongue pressed against my teeth the way you stop a sneeze. The third time my mouth opens by itself, and the sound that comes out is one I have never made, thin and far away and terribly careful, a sliver of a cry designed to be answered. I close my mouth. I put the back of my hand against my lips as if I'm checking for fever. Behind the bones of my face, the sound I did not make continues a moment longer, curling back through the chambers of my head. It fades like a breath on a window. The next morning, the city is unsentimental. A woman drops a bag of oranges and one rolls under a bus. A man coughs so hard he has to stop and salute his own lungs. Pigeons gossip. Somewhere a child is crying for a real reason. I stand at my window with a mug and let the ordinary enter me, a patient transfusion. I tell myself I won. I broke the machine. I will not feed it again. For 3 days it stays away from the edge of hearing. On the fourth, while washing a cup, the thin cry floats up from the drain, my own vowel bent back on itself, eager as a hand in the dark. I cut the water, I listen to the pipes settle. I watch my breath fog the kitchen window. I consider the possibility that some sounds, once you have learned their shape, are yours forever, like a scar you wear inside. Perhaps the room in the dunes didn't want me. Maybe it only wanted to teach me the way to call, and now there is no unlearning. I imagine the scientists with their charts of formants and their tidy graphs, and I imagine the space under those graphs where awe and fear live. There are chambers everywhere for shadows to practice in. I leave the cup in the sink. I walk to the bedroom without letting the floorboards learn the rhythm of my steps. I sit on the edge of the bed and do a childish thing. I put my hands over my ears. It helps as much as it ever did. The city pours through my palms. My breathing becomes the only thing, a metronome that marks out a room I can survive in. When I take my hands away, there is no cry, just the refrigerator's old man's sigh and the small creak of wood cooling. I think of the dunes and the way the building became smaller as I left it. I think of sound as a tide, sometimes returning what it took, sometimes leaving behind a shell that looks like a mouth. I will go back tomorrow to hand in the keys. I will tell them the array is broken and should remain broken. I will say it calmly, in the kindly voice you use for bad news. And tonight, if the room inside my head offers me that thin cry to fill the spaces of silence, I will give it nothing. I will let the shadows speak to themselves. I will not be the echo that teaches them a name to call me by. The kettle clicks in the other room as if just finishing a boil, though I haven't touched it. I stand very still. The apartment measures my attention and learns another shape. Somewhere far under the floor, down in the coiled metal of the pipes, something answers, careful and small, low. I do not reply. The silence that follows is not empty. It is full of a presence held just at the edge of definition, waiting with the patience of dunes. I imagine it smiling the way a sound might, and then I stop imagining and hold to the ordinary. The weight of the mug, the straw scratch of my sweater on my wrist, the way the window smudges the city into blocks of moving gray. I do what I can. I breathe as quietly as a person can breathe, and I listen to everything else. I told myself I was only going to stay long enough to take photos and measurements. The email from the law firm had been curt. We need an inventory and condition report of the Kroll property by Monday. Keys enclosed. Payment upon completion. I'd done these gigs before. Condemned duplexes, foreclosed bungalows, the occasional farmhouse that sagged under 3 generations of silence. But the Kroll house sat at the end of a road that forgot it was a road. And even my car seemed relieved when I finally killed the engine and let it tick itself cool. The house didn't loom so much as tilt toward me, a long, narrow Victorian with a mansard roof and windows that weren't quite symmetrical. The porch steps had a wobble to them, like loose teeth. The autumn air smelled of wet leaves and something sweeter beneath, like old apples turned to cider in the crawlspace of a barn. The key turned with a heavy click. The front door sighed open, dragging a long arc in the dust across the foyer floor. I stood there for a moment, my headlamp making a white tunnel into the interior darkness, and listened to the house breathe. Old wood contracts and expands, nails move imperceptibly in their holes, the wind tries the cracks and keyholes. These are the explanations you repeat until they settle in your bones. I said them out loud. Old wood, nails, wind. My voice sounded too present in the front hall, too near to me, like I'd leaned into my own ear to whisper. I crossed the threshold. Inside, the air was cooler and smelled faintly of iron and damp plaster. To the left, a parlor with burlap-covered furniture. To the right, a formal dining room where a spider had strung a guy wire from chandelier to hutch as thick as a violin string. My footsteps showed up behind me as gray ovals in the dust, one for each soul, neat as ink stamps. I put my backpack down on a side table that rasped under the weight and started my list. Front hall, cracked ceiling medallion, water staining, wallpaper bubbled and lifting like fish scales. Parlor, fireplace with a collapsed throat, ash pale as talc, a fire poker left propped against the grout as if someone had been interrupted mid-stoke. The house took my presence the way a pond takes a thrown stone, concentric ripples and an odd, low sound that was almost a note. On my third trip from parlor to dining room, I noticed the front door had drifted shut behind me. I hadn't touched it. It had closed itself with all the deliberateness of a person unsure about privacy. When I opened it again, the night outside leaned in with a wash of cricket song and the faint, far hiss of tires on the highway. I wedged a brick in the jam. By the time I'd made a full circuit of the ground floor, the last of the light had drained to gunmetal. I set up camp on the dining room floor, sleeping bag, thermos, a small butane stove to heat a can of soup. The act of unpacking made the house feel, if not friendly, at least negotiable. Something lived in the pipes, maybe squirrels. Every 10 minutes a scuttle would course from one wall to the next, like a thought changing its mind. The first odd noise came while the soup simmered. A faint tink, 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 a glass chime struck by a fingernail. I turned and saw the chandelier crystals nudging each other in a current of air I could not feel. They made tiny collisions, an insect rain. I stood beneath them and held my breath. The crystals went still. I exhaled, stepped back. Tink, tink. The house was reminding me of its height, the volume above my head, the space a person could float and never touch. Old house, I said to the empty room, settling. Half an hour later, the second noise. A soft, steady rhythm above me, like someone walking heel to toe down a hallway with patience and care. It crossed overhead and stopped. Then, from another room, it resumed, more distant this time, then close again, circling. I was alone. I knew I was alone. I let the soup boil until it formed a skin, then ate it scalding hot to have something to do with my mouth besides call out hello. When I finally convinced myself to check upstairs, the staircase accepted my weight in long shutters. My headlamp skated over picture frames where images had been removed, leaving behind sun-bleached rectangles edged with adhesive ghosts. The upper hallway was narrower than it should have been, like the walls had inhaled. Closed doors on either side, hinge squeaks tuned to different keys. I opened each in turn. A bedroom with a cracked mirror that reflected my lamp in multiples, a nursery with a toppled cradle and a moth somersaulting against the glass of the single window, a study where a chalk diagram was half erased on the slate-painted wall. That was where the third noise found me. Whispering. Not words, exactly, but the shape words make against a microphone when you're just a little too close. I stood in the study and tried to find the source, turning like a dog with a flea behind its ear. The whispering came from wherever I wasn't looking. My scalp felt suddenly cold, every hair a tuning fork. "Hello?" I said, because of course I did. I'm just here doing an inventory. I'm not here to what? To disturb? To trespass? To hear you?" Something moved in the mirror behind me. It wasn't a figure, it was the absence of one, the sudden dark where my headlamp failed to land. The hair at my nape pulled tight as if a static charge had caught it. When I spun around, there was nothing standing there, only a vague smutch in the dust I could convince myself was a boot print if I wanted to go on believing in boots. Back downstairs, I wrote faster. I photographed the chandelier. I measured cracks. I tried to force the house into columns and rows, length, width, condition, notes. The numbers were anchors, and when they failed to hold, I poured coffee and forced myself to sit very still. For a while, nothing happened. Calm settled, as thin and delicate as the ash in the cold fireplace. Calm is a kind of permission. It invited my mind to wander, and in wandering, it rubbed up against things better left smooth. Why was the study chalkboard set that way, with concentric circles and lines that radiated like compass points? Why did the nursery have 2 windows from the outside but only one from within? The longer I sat, the more off-kilter the geometry felt, as if my head had been tilted 2 degrees without my noticing. These are details you tell yourself you'll write later and never do. I was repacking my backpack for a run out to the car when I noticed the brick no longer propped the front door. The door stood shut tight, the brick sitting innocently beside the umbrella stand. I hadn't moved it. "Okay," I said. "I get it." I turned the knob. The door did not open. The deadbolt was unthrown. The knob turned freely, but the door held itself closed, the way a person holds a secret between their teeth. I set my shoulder to it. The wood flexed, but did not give. Panic is a small thing at first, an uncoiling inside the lungs. It doesn't help to say don't panic. It's like telling water not to be wet. I breathed until my hands stopped bouncing at the end of my arms, and then I remembered the back door off the kitchen. It opened into a collapsed mudroom where the roof had fallen in, and ivy thrust a green hand into the dark. That door gave. I dragged it and slipped outside into air that tasted shockingly new, as if it hadn't been breathed before I breathed it. I stood in the yard, hands on knees, headlamp diffused by misting rain, and laughed. It sounded wrong. It sounded like it came from a little behind me, a fraction of a second out of sync. When I turned, no one stood there. I should have left then, inventory be damned. I don't know why I didn't. Pride, maybe, or the small meanness that passes itself off as curiosity. I re-entered the house through the kitchen. The light from my headlamp swung and caught the hallway to the basement, door ajar, stairs down steep as a thought you know you shouldn't have and have anyway. The whispering came again, lighter this time, teased up by a low draft, and underneath it a faint metallic clink, like cutlery knocking together in a drawer. "Fine," I said aloud, to the empty house, to my own trembling. "You want me downstairs? Let's go." The basement smelled of damp stone and penny coins. My lamp found walls that were not poured concrete, but fieldstone mortared with something that had aged to the color of tooth. Shelves sagged under the weight of glass jars sealed with wax, peaches suspended in syrup to the waist, beans limbed as if called to attention, a laundry sink deep enough to baptize your sins in. The clinking resolved itself as I descended, a chain somewhere under gentle tension. A small, rational corner of my brain said hot water heater, and the rest of me wished fiercely to believe it. Halfway down I saw my shadow on the wall ahead of me, and I stopped because my lamp didn't cast it. I was facing forward. The beam pointed at the packed earth floor, and yet my silhouette lay crisp on the far wall as if a spotlight had blossomed behind me. Slowly, as if moving underwater, I turned my head. There was no light source behind me. There was only the stairs, the door at the top of them, and the darkness in it. But my shadow deepened on the wall as if it were being inked in by an unseen hand. The head bent a fraction of a beat before mine did. The left hand rose a heartbeat after I raised it. When I stepped down 2 stairs, it waited leisurely, almost lazy, and then stepped down 3. "No," I said, meaning nothing. "No." The whispering rose, a soft, dry susurrus like pages turned in a room where someone is trying not to wake a sleeping child. The chain clinked once, twice, like punctuation. The shadow moved with the assuredness of someone who has practiced all the ways you move and selected the better ones. And then the lights went out, pure black. Not the idea of black, not darkness as background, but black that occupies space. My heart stumbled. I froze because anything else would have been crashing, and the black welcomed me the way a lake welcomes a stone. In the dark, the house was audible in new ways. The pipes murmured to themselves in a language of expansion and contraction. A bubble rose somewhere far inside the walls and burst with a tick. And underneath it, the other sound, my breath, and the second breath that tracked it, not echo, but parallel, a counterfeit. I reached up to adjust my headlamp and felt the strap still snug. The lamp itself had simply failed. When I smacked it with the heel of my hand, the casing rang like a dull bell. The shadow on the wall had no need of light. It could move without witness. From above, a door I had left open closed with a long, decisive drag. The house was separating me into compartments. Basements have always been about division. Above and below, past and present, yours and what you inherit without asking. "Okay," I whispered. Okay. I reached in my pocket for my phone. A weak light bloomed. My hands looked lunar, bone blue. The beam shook as I swept it across the space, landing at last on the wall opposite the stairs. the wall my shadow should have claimed. It was blank stone, pitted and damp, the mortar traced by white efflorescence like frost. The shadow had gone. It was behind me. I didn't hear it move. I felt the temperature shift against my back, a coolness shaped like my outline, a negative of me pressed close enough that my shoulders registered pressure with no touch. I lifted the phone higher. The light stuttered in my trembling hand and caught something impossible. Not a shape, but a lack of shape. An area of perfect daubed absence where the beam fell into and did not come out. It clung to the floor like a spill and rose like smoke, and where it touched the shelves the jars emptied themselves of color, went matte and meaningless, as if uninvented. I don't know what I thought I could do. Argue with it? Reason with a hole? The chain clinked again, once, and then all the jars shivered lightly, as if something had brushed past them on its way toward me. "Who are you?" I asked, and heard myself ask it from the other side of the room. "Who are you?" Perfectly overlapped, perfectly quiet, my own voice and not my own, coming from where the dark thickened. It wasn't a ghost. Ghosts are stories people tell themselves about shape and want. This was more like a habit in the house, a groove worn by repetition, a residue of presence hungry for more of the same. The old diagrams upstairs, the chalk circles, the compass lines, they weren't art. They were instructions, or maybe a signal. Maybe the Krolls had done it on purpose. Maybe the house learned the trick from them. It had become a device for holding a person-shaped absence in reserve until it could slip it over the next person to enter like a new skin. The shadow moved wrong. It misremembered the order of things, lifted its hand too late or too soon. I thought of how my laugh outside had arrived a moment behind me. I thought of the closed front door and how the air had felt in the foyer, my voice too near to my own ear. The house didn't just want me in it. It wanted me on file. My phone chose that moment to die, an abrupt black wink. The basement breathed in. It was purely instinct that sent me up the stairs, a scramble on all fours, fingers blind to each riser until they found it and pulled. Something colder than air touched the cuff of my jeans and then let go, as if testing the boundary. At the top I hit the door with my shoulder and felt it hold, then flex, then release, as if the house decided to let me have this round for the sake of sport. I burst into the kitchen, into a light that was no real light at all, just the dark slightly less dense. I didn't run for the front door. The house would have locked it again. I went for the dining room and the fireplace instead. Dry wood lay stacked in the grate, as if waiting for this, for me. An old Bic sat on the mantelpiece. The first flick gave me a flame that died in the cross-draft of the chimney. The second struggled up and then caught. Fire introduced a different kind of light, wilder, less polite, made of teeth. Shadows sprang into being everywhere at once, and then fled as the flames reached for them. I fed the fire until it roared like a living thing. The house sighed. Across the room, something black and glossy as wet paint receded toward the doorway, making the angle of the frame look once removed from itself. For a heartbeat, the firelight cast my shadow on the far wall, tall and long-limbed, and for that heartbeat, it didn't move. It lagged behind me, just a fraction. And then, as if I had given it a cue, it lifted its head. I grabbed a chair and shoved it under the front door handle like we were in a movie pretending a chair would keep a house at bay. Fire popped. Heat licked my face. The dining room was bright enough now that the chandelier crystals chimed to themselves as the air climbed. The shadow pulled itself thin in the doorway to the hall, a smear that made the wood grain ripple. "What do you want?" I asked, never taking my eyes off it. It answered by matching my words with an identical question. My voice stretched a little, like tape warped in the sun. I felt something in my chest tilt. It wanted what all houses want, to be filled, to be full of roles and routines, to learn my routes and loops so well that it could run them without me. It wanted to separate me into circuits and run them in the walls. I was not the first, and I doubted I would be the last. "I'm leaving," I said. "Leaving." The dining room repeated from a moment ago. The echo came late. The house was still learning me. The fire guttered once as if something leaned over it, and then the chimney roared back in a column, a sound like breath reversed. I backed toward the kitchen, keeping the fire between me and the hall. I had one goal, reach the back door again, the one that had yielded to insistence. I reached the threshold when the shadow made its first real move, a swipe across the floor that had no friction sound, no cloth or skin in it, just subtraction. The chair at the front door slid an inch on its own. "Don't," I said. It was reflex as much as language. My palm found the kitchen doorframe. I ran my hand along the wall until it found the cold brass of the back doorknob. The door opened. The night beyond was less a space than a direction of a way. I stepped through and the air changed, thinner, wetter, shot through with the smell of rain and road tar. For an instant, I felt the house hesitate behind me, like an animal that has gotten most of the way through a fence and is reconsidering the size of its hips. And then it let me go. I didn't look back until I was at the car. When I did, the front windows of the house were bright with firelight, and in each I could see a tall, dark shape in the glass, not a figure, but a subtraction, as though the house were holding up proofs of me and deciding which one to keep. The engine caught. Gravel roared. I drove until the road remembered itself, and then for several kilometers beyond, stopping only when the fuel light blinked and my hands finally unclenched enough to let me pull into a petrol station, where a woman at the counter asked if I needed anything else. And I laughed, the sound arriving the moment I laughed it, no delay, no second voice. I sat in the car with the pump clicking and watched my reflection in the dark of the passenger window to make sure it moved when I moved. It did. Mostly. I filed the report the next day. Structural issues, it said. Unsafe occupancy. Severe water damage. I did not mention the diagrams or the air upstairs that made listening feel like drowning. I did not mention the basement. I did not mention the late arriving laugh or the hand that didn't keep up with me when the firelight threw me long. I recommended demolition, and the firm wrote back, under review. At night now, when I walk from the bedroom to the bathroom, my shadow follows me down the hall, slender and ordinary in mine. But sometimes, when I pass the mirror at the end, I catch the tail of it lingering on the wall a fraction longer than it should, like a polite guest who doesn't want to seem eager to leave. I don't turn my head to see if it will peel itself away and follow after. I don't ask what it learned, what it keeps in reserve. And I do not drive that road anymore. Not because I'm afraid of the house exactly, but because I'm afraid it might open the door for me if I showed up again. I'm afraid of that small delay between me and me, the moment where the world gets to decide which version is the original and which is the study, and where a place with an excellent memory might choose to keep practicing until it knows me better than I know myself. If the Kroll house is torn down, sometimes I think, it won't matter. Habits don't need walls. They only need a route through someone. I leave the lights on when I can. I avoid standing still in doorways, and I never ever laugh outside at night, just in case the echo is waiting to arrive. I told myself I was going to the forest for the light, not the fresh golden kind that sprawls over open fields, but the light that squeezes through needles and moss in thin, precise blades, the kind that makes a scene look like a secret you're not supposed to witness. I'd taken an assignment to photograph the Alder Path Reserve, a heritage stand nearly untouched, for a magazine that paid mostly in coffee and prestige, but the excuse was enough. The ranger station at the edge of the trailhead was a one-room cabin with a corkboard of faded trail maps, a bottle of hand sanitizer that smelled like stale vodka, and a volunteer in a green vest who never asked my name. "Stay on the orange markers," he said, eyes sliding past me to the door. "If you feel turned around, don't push deeper. The reserve holds sound in strange ways." "Echoes?" I asked, shouldering my pack. He rubbed a thumb along a nick in the counter. "Something like that." Outside, the forest pitched up into a low, dark swell. A sign, Alder Path Reserve, no campfires, leaned on two tilted posts as if exhausted by the warning. The air tasted like wet iron, and somewhere I couldn't see, water ticked steadily across with the patience of a metronome. I checked my compass, took a picture of the trailhead sign, habit, a breadcrumb for later, and stepped beneath the canopy. The world changed in 5 strides. The sun was still behind me somewhere, but under the conifers it learned to whisper. Light fell in columns and broke on slabs of nurse logs, pools of moss, and ferns that shivered like something breathing. The ground was quiet, padded with duff drying from the rain, but anything firm, root, or flat stone, made a dry tap under my boots that sounded indecently loud. I found the first orange marker a few minutes in, a ribbon looped around a branch at shoulder height. Beyond it, another tag flashed like a small wound. Easy. I'd planned for a single night. I'd lodge in a public-use bunk at the West Shelter, shoot the morning light, return by noon. A simple plan. The path braided through the understory, narrowing to almost nothing, and then widening again so fast I thought the forest, like a host who disapproves of a guest, couldn't decide whether to make room for me or hem me in. Twice I thought I saw someone standing off the trail, what looked like a shape between the trees, not moving, not waving, only to realize it was the geometry of trunks and shadow, the things your eyes wire together when you give them too much dark. I walked. The first odd thing happened an hour in. It was a voice, not words, just the shape of a voice, like the throat noise someone makes before they speak your name. It came from behind me, and my body did the stupid thing before my mind caught up. I turned and said, "Yeah?" to nobody, my breath puffing in the cold. Silence answered. I laughed, small, to break the spell. A woodpecker hammered out a hard, impatient rhythm somewhere high above, and the forest resumed being a place where explanations existed. Wind. A squirrel. The light. I hoisted my camera, framed a clean shot of a cedar with a scar widened by lightning, and told myself not to be precious about being alone. By midday the path thickened with huckleberry shrubs and damp ferns, the orange ribbons showing like warnings at the edge of my vision. I ate on a rock beside a little runnel, an arrangement of stones that sounded like a beginner learning to play water, and let the quiet sink in. It's a different quiet under trees. It has texture, a layered hush that presses into your ears. If I took my mind off my breathing and listened, I could make out the far scrubs of movement, a deer stepping careful as a thief, rain that began and ended in the canopy, the note of a blue jay that sounded like a door hinge left too long in weather. I repacked, stood, and found my compass needle describing a restless circle as if the earth had forgotten how to choose north. It steadied when I moved, like a dog remembering its role. The orange ribbon ahead pulled me on, bright and idiotic in the green. The second odd thing, a set of boot prints appeared alongside mine in a soft patch of mud, not old, not washed with rain. Deep heel, then a toe swirl where the foot had twisted as if turning to look over a shoulder. Parallel to mine for 15 paces, then gone. I walked faster. The shelter was supposed to be 4 miles in, but either the miles stretched or I was folded into them. The forest began to rhyme with itself. I passed a snag carved by beetles into a cathedral window. 20 minutes later, there it was again. The same ragged arch, the same black shelf of fungi like a stack of broken plates. Another ribbon, another small runnel with the same 3 stones set like teeth. My sense of humor, which has saved me more than once, climbed to the top of my head and jumped off without a word. A breeze went through the canopy. The needles whispered in a braided hush. A smell like penny metal came and went. I gripped my camera too tight. When the next voice came, this time a clear, soft Lena, my name, I didn't answer. I don't remember giving my name to the volunteer. I didn't sign the logbook. It was buried under pamphlets and a coffee mug stamped with "Be nice or leave." I hadn't said it aloud for hours. But that voice, my sister's voice, the exact pitch and tumble, the breathy pause before the vowel, said it again from a little way off the trail, and everything in me wanted to say, "Here, I'm here." The oldest reflex, the ring in me that has answered that call since we were children. I kept walking, mouth hot with my bitten tongue. The orange ribbons multiplied. They were too close together now, hung at jittery intervals, some looped low enough to brush my cheek. A few were frayed, edges fuzzy with damp, as if chewed. When I looked too long at one, fine hairs along its edge seemed to quiver, reaching, but the breeze was gone. There was no wind. As dusk gathered, the forest did what all forests do. It stopped being theory and turned into rooms. The spaces between trees took on walls and corners, hallways and ceilings. I stopped to chalk an arrow on a smooth-faced rock pointing back the way I'd come, an old trick from a hiking blog I'd laughed at when I read it, for when your brain won't stop lying to you about the trail. I went on for 10 minutes, realized I'd looped, and came back to the rock. The arrow pointed the other way. The third odd thing happened at the door. I didn't know there would be a door. The shelter was marked on the map as an icon, a little square with a triangle perched on it, and I had pictured something open, rain-silvered, a picnic table with chewed corners and a pile of damp firewood. I almost hit the door with my nose. It was tall and gray-green with weather, a plank thing fitted crudely into an opening hacked from a cedar trunk. Bark had grown around the frame. A set of 3 carved lines ran down the right-hand side like claw marks. My breath blew back on me in the stillness. The door was unlatched. Inside was darker than outside, the way a shadow has a different density than the air. A table, a bunk, a window punched through with a board and a square of plastic stapled in place of glass. A smell like old sap and damp wool and something sweeter underneath that made me think of hospitals. Relief and dread arrived at the same time and crashed into each other at the threshold. I stepped in, shoved the door closed, dropped the wooden bar into place, and listened to the heavy, decisive way the world ended at the plank. I lit my little stove, ate, and said out loud, "House rules. Talk to yourself to keep the other voices quiet. Okay. Okay, this is fine. This is a shelter. You sleep, you go at first light. You can turn this into a story about a day that was longer than it should have been." When I cut the flame, the dark slid back like a muscle. My headlamp made a cone no wider than a breath. The forest pressed against the walls and waited. I set my recorder beside my sleeping bag, another habit from freelancing. An audio scrap can save a bad assignment, and clicked it on to catch the cabin's ambience. Something about proof always helps. Being able to point later and say it wasn't only in my head, it was in the air. The knock came exactly as I lay down. 3 raps, deliberate, at the door. I froze. The wood quivered faintly under the sound. The pause held so long I thought my pulse would drill through the mattress. Somewhere far off, an owl asked a bored, rhetorical question. My throat made a dry sound. Knock, knock, knock. I crawled to the door, pressed my ear to the seam. I heard nothing but a dead quiet so deep it had weight. "Who's there?" I said, knowing as I said it that a carved warning I hadn't yet seen would tell me not to ask that. The forest inhaled. The sweetness under the wood smell thickened. Something moved along the wall outside, a slow drag. It made the room smaller in a way I can't explain, as if the corners were being tightened. Near the floor, a shadow thicker than the dark bled into the space under the door and recoiled, like a hand testing water. I checked the recorder to anchor myself in the list of things that were real. The red light winked. That's when the voice said my name right in my ear. Lena. It was not my sister's voice now. It was my own, replayed from a second ago, shaped with the exact sleep sand rasp, the awake too long edge. The recorder's red light stuttered. On its tiny meter, thin lines of sound hopped and fell as if my fear had a voice and the device could see it. I flicked it off. The sudden absence felt like stepping backward off a step you forgot was there. I found the warning carved into the table then. Do not answer when it uses your name. Each letter was peeled back from the grain with a patience that had not been human. Below, in smaller, frantic scratches, do not look for the mouth. The problem with warnings is how they expand to fill a room. Mouth was nothing more than a shape and a guess, and already the walls were full of them. My headlamp beam jittered, throwing dumbbells of shadow around the room as if there were 6 of me, each trembling. I pulled the bar tighter across the door, dragged the table in front, then the bunk. Absurd, but the mind needs rituals. If you tell yourself you are building walls, maybe you can convince your fear that you've made a house. The next hour had shape, but no real events, like a nightmare that stays on the other side of a window. The wind didn't blow. The rain didn't start. A slow scrape traveled the exterior boards and circled the cabin. Once it paused at the window and pressed there, and the plastic puckered inward around a dark that was both thick and flat. I counted, whispered numbers into my sleeve, 36, 37, 38. In the space between 39 and 40, something slithered against the door and said my name, too close, in a tone of patient instruction. Lena, it crooned, like teaching a child to separate a sound into parts. The recorder was off, but the room was not free of my voice. My voice now gathered in the corners, a condensation of breath. From the seam by the floor, a thin scent pushed in, vanilla and sap and old pennies. I thought of a mouth. I thought of my name folded like a leaf and placed on a tongue. I jammed my hat between my teeth to keep from answering. If there was a moment that turned night into something else, it was a small one. The forest, whatever the forest was, coughed. Not a sound I could have imagined, a scrape, a wet click, an unpracticed, clumsy clearing of a throat like a learning. Then, almost cheerfully from outside and both too near and too far, "Where are you?" I spat the hat out. "Not here," I croaked, and only realized afterwards that I had answered. Silence spread and thinned, as if the woods were exhaling slow enough to not alarm a creature that would run if it realized it was being watched. A minute later, across the door, the slow drag began again. It dragged until it found the boards where, as a test, I had lodged my pocket knife earlier, blade angled outward. The drag paused. The knife clicked as if pushed back gently with a fingernail. I'm not brave when I'm cornered. I'm practical. My plan assembled itself on the back of my tongue. Sound draws sound. If it wanted my name, I would give it another. I fumbled in my pack for my spare memory card, found instead a skein of red cord I used to tag tripod legs and a felt-tip pen. On the inside of the door, where my light made a small private mourning, I wrote in big letters the name Ella, nobody, no one I knew, and tied the red cord to the bar. The cord trailed under the door like a lure. I flicked the recorder back on. I spoke into it at arm's length. "Ella, Ella, Ella." The recorder caught and looped. I taped the play button down with a strip of bandage and slid the little device under the door with the cord, pushing it with 2 fingers until it snagged and held. On the other side, plastic rustled. The recorder's red light flashed through the seam like a pulse. Sound went predator silent. Every muscle in me screamed. I waited 3 breaths, 5, 7. At 8, something huge threw itself at the door. The cabin jumped. The table skittered forward and slammed my shin. The bar creaked like a neck. The knife, eased back by those cool, patient fingertips, went clattering. I shoved, heels braced, spine electric, and held while whatever was on the other side learned, with interest and rising delight, the difference between a door that opens and a door that opens when you push exactly here. The recorder's little tin voice repeated its wrong name into the seam. "Ella, Ella, Ella." I didn't say my own. I said nothing at all until my breath was an organized pain. The blows slowed, then softened, then became the airy, almost tender brushing of fingertips on wood. Then nothing. I waited. When I moved the table back from the door, it was morning. Gray seeped in around the plastic and turned the conspiracy of darkness back into a room with things in it. The vanilla penny smell was faint now, diluted by dew. I untied the cord, felt it go slack. Something had chewed the end into a puckered, damp tassel. The recorder was gone. I left the shelter like I was coming up from underwater, not knowing whether to gulp or gag. The knock marks were new, pale wounds in the wood. At shoulder height, in the sticky sap around them, something had pressed a shape as if testing the idea of a hand. It was easier going, or I was different. The orange ribbons thinned. The trail decided to be a trail again. When the forest called my name passed through a throat that became less sure of its vowels the more it spoke. I let it. I did not give it my mouth in exchange. When it tried other names, my sister's, my mother's, I said nothing, not even inside my skull. The morning was a cathedral of fog, scrap light filtering in, softening everything into the idea of itself. I thought I'd made it when I saw the trailhead sign, warping back into a rectangle, and the ranger cabin beyond it with its modest roof and beseeching corkboard. A blue jay scolded the day. The volunteer sat where I had left him, hunched over the counter with the same gravitational wariness, a newspaper spread like roadkill under his palms. He lifted his face as I stamped in, knocked damp from my hair, swallowed, and gave me a small, relieved nod. Up close his eyes looked as if someone had polished the iris with a thumb. "How'd you do?" he asked. "I stayed at the West Shelter," I said, trying not to hear the echo of my voice outside a door. "And I heard. I couldn't say my name. I said, something." He tugged the paper straight. "That happens sometimes if you don't make it out before dark." "You didn't ask my name yesterday," I said. "Was that on purpose?" The corners of his mouth twitched. I try not to carry too much into the reserve. On the corkboard behind him, the logbook sat open. Pages and pages of names in neat lines, the handwriting clumping in clusters across certain months. Between October and April, stay on marked trails only. My eyes landed on a signature 4 lines down in a handwriting too much like mine to be coincidence. Lena, no last name, entered yesterday at 10:45 a.m. A tiny smear of sap glistened on the loop of the L. I hadn't written it. I didn't, I began. The volunteer looked over my shoulder toward the door. Sometimes, he said, it helps to go by something else a while. He slid across the counter, a paper cup with a tea bag bleeding amber into the water. The steam smelled like smoke and cedar. He didn't look at me when he said softly, "Whatever happened last night, you should probably not talk to it about it." I nodded without meaning to. He didn't ask me to sign out. I didn't ask him why there were 3 pale lines carved into the right-hand frame of his door. In the car, I sat for a long time with my forehead against the steering wheel and let my hands pretend to be still. The clock told me more time had passed than I remembered, which felt like a small, useless kindness. I backed out, tires spitting gravel, and took the road that looked like all roads that leave a place you want to be gone from. The world widened again. The trees stepped back. I reached the first faint fingers of cell service, and my phone bloomed with messages from a different life. A client asking for a revision, my sister sending a photo of a croissant in another country, a news alert about rain. I rolled the window down to make the real air push on my face and laughed, and the laugh sounded like it had something on its back. At the gas station on the highway, I bought a coffee that tasted like fear would if it were hot. I reached into my pack for my wallet and felt instead a small, hard rectangle lodged where the lining had detached. I fished it free. It was my recorder. Dirt haloed its edges. Sap had dried in a glossy sheet over the buttons, preserving my taped-down loop like a relic in amber. The little red light was dead. When I pried the casing open with a coin, a sweetness came up that hit the top of my throat and made my eyes water. Whatever had been chewing at the door had been chewing at this too. The speaker was clogged with something that looked like pale sawdust, and when I touched it, broke apart into a fine powder that clung to my skin as if it were wet. I sat with it for a long time. I thought about throwing it in the bin with the biodegradable coffee stirrers and the lottery tickets and the old receipts for lives measured in points. I thought about bringing it to a friend who could pull something from its memory. I thought about the warning carved into the table, "Do not look for the mouth." I wiped my hands on my jeans. I put the recorder back in my pack. At home, when the city's light made its predictable geometry on my wall, I laid the recorder on my desk like a paperweight and did not touch it for hours. The forest smell slowly bled from it and made my apartment into a version of the shelter, then a version of itself, a series of rooms, each narrower than the last. At midnight, I told myself I would sleep if I could turn a piece of this into proof, because that made it a thing with edges. I plugged the recorder into my computer with a cable whose end had small tooth marks I did not examine. I dragged a single file into my desktop, 01 Wave. My finger rested on the spacebar, stupid, ritual, ready. I didn't press play. It pressed itself. Static at first, the soft planet weather sound of the world's noise. Then the cabin, its particular hush. A bump, a creak, the innocent life of a wooden room cooling. My breath, my stupid human proof. The scrape at the wall, the first knock, the second, the third. My voice saying, "Who's there?" the exact wrong shape of the wrong question. Then, through the layer of everything, something found a new mouth. Ella, it said, my baited name. It said it again, tasting the syllables. Ella. It learned fast. The third time it said it, the pitch was closer to my pitch when I was tired and trying to sound like I wasn't. The fourth time, it found the warm place where a voice puts your name when it means to be gentle. The fifth time, it used the way my sister says it. The sixth time, it didn't say Ella at all. It said the name I don't tell anyone, the one from my grandmother, the one said once a year on a day that used to be happy. I reached for the space bar and, in the second before my thumb could stop this, a small wet click sounded, a mouth practicing. "Where are you?" it asked, in a voice that wasn't mine yet and would be someday if I let it. I hit pause. The apartment stopped. My building's plumbing sighed. A car hissed by on wet pavement 6 floors below. Someone laughed on the sidewalk and the sound climbed the bricks and pressed its face to my window. My throat felt lined with sawdust that didn't belong to any tree I knew. A different file appeared on my desktop, produced from nowhere, titled with 3 carved lines. Not something I dragged, a consequence, a gift. It waited, patient as a forest that has found a way to be in a room. My computer's cursor flickered near it. The recorder on the desk made no light, and every light. The sky outside my window was a little paler than it should have been, like morning was remembering me. I stood, picked up the recorder, and took it to the sink. I filled the basin with water. The smell of sap rose like prayer. I thought about fire, about salt, about turning my mouth into a place with a locked door. I thought about the volunteer's eyes and how carefully he had not said my name. I thought about the orange ribbons trembling, as if they were more than plastic. I set the recorder in the water. It did not sink. It floated, stubborn and ridiculous, on a film of something that refused the idea of wet. The computer in the living room made a small sound, curious and delighted, as if a new device had been connected. On the paused waveform, a thin line twitched. The knock came then, polite and soft, from inside my wall. 3 raps. You'd expect panic, but panic is the luxury of people who have not been taught. I learned last night. I stood with my hands on the edge of the sink and said nothing at all. The knocking paused, then tried again, a hair closer, a hair more confident. The basin water hummed like a thin string plucked once and left to quiver. My name hung in the apartment like a fruit. I watched it ripen and decided not to pick it. I took a breath and held it until it made a clean ache at the center of my chest. And without reaching for the computer, without pressing play, without giving the knocking even my eyes, I turned out the kitchen light and left the recorder to float in the gray. Morning would come, or something like it. The forest would learn, or I would stop teaching. I arrived just before dusk, when the sky over the industrial quarter turned the color of old bruises and the wind moved in long metallic sighs down the empty street. The listing had called it a minimalist artist loft in a converted telephone exchange. Concrete floors, whitewashed brick, lofty ceilings. Unfamiliar, yes, but cheap, and for 2 weeks I'd have it to myself. A place to work, to be quiet, to sleep without the nagging fear that something would step out of the corner if I woke at 3 a.m. and looked straight on. The front door opened with a small electrical cough. Inside, the space was almost aggressively tidy. 1 bed on a metal frame, a thin rug that looked like it had been poured, not woven, a kitchenette with 2 cups, 2 bowls, and no knives sharp enough to do more than bruise a tomato. The corners were unnaturally clean. The painter who'd whitewashed the brick had been diligent with a small brush, packing paint into the angles until they looked caulked shut. I put my bag on the bed and stood a while, listening. The building hummed, a low, steady, muscle-deep tone as if the concrete itself were remembering old electricity. Beneath that, tiny, periodic clicks. In another place it would have read as a house settling. Here it sounded like someone practicing patience. I told myself it was the old breaker boxes, the ducts, the ghosts of wires cut from their chalk-marked paths. I told myself other things, too. That the last time I'd seen him, I had been 7 years old and half asleep. That I had outgrown childish ideas because I had outgrown the room that incubated them. I flipped on every light just because I could. While the kettle heated its little pool of water, I unpacked. The ordinary acts calmed me. Notebook, pens, a sweater folded on the chair. The hum took on a companionable quality, like a cat's purr, and the brittle light softened. It was large enough to feel anonymous, that room. Standing in the middle of it, I felt like a dot on graph paper. When the kettle screamed, I jumped so hard I spilled water across the counter. The sound cut off mid-wail. The click stopped, too, with a final polite tick, and didn't return while I made tea. I told myself that was funny. Only when I sat on the bed, cup steaming between my hands, did I notice how the corners darkened faster than the rest of the room. The sun had dropped behind the warehouse across the street, thinning the light into orange sheets. The angles gulped it. Even with every lamp on, the 4 corners drank their portion and held it in their throats. I focused on the tea, the minty warmth, the window's reflections elongating as evening moved, the hum now steady again, calm. A strand of hair tickled my cheek. I brushed it aside and felt rather than saw, motion at the edge of vision, a quick compression, like paper folding itself. I turned. The far left corner was only a corner, white on shadow, nothing else. "It's fine," I said aloud, because I'm the kind of person who answers silence. "It's just a new place." Hearing my voice in the big room made it thinner than I expected. It sounded like it came from someone standing behind me. Night descended in practical steps. One light went dim and returned. The refrigerator whispered an old complaint and slept again. A car passed somewhere below and drew a ribbon of reflection along the ceiling. I brushed my teeth, turned down the bed, and creep-tested the bathroom door with a flourish that felt both ridiculous and necessary. Back in the room, I paused halfway to the lamp. It was the smallest change. My notebook was no longer where I'd set it. I had laid it square to the table's edge. Now it sat at an angle, a corner overhanging the surface, as if reaching for the floor. I smiled without liking the feeling of doing it, and slid the notebook back to its square. The click came from the corner nearest the bed, 2 clicks like teeth gently testing a cherry pit. The old memory slipped from wherever it usually lived. A room far smaller than this, wallpaper damp as a dog's nose, a nightlight shaped like a bear. The man who could exist only as a shape within a shape. A man built of angles, knees that reversed and stayed reversed, shoulders too sharp to be comfortable to look at. He had never crossed the room, only bent closer by increments when I wasn't looking, as if he moved along the ropes of sight. He had a name I would not say, not then. Not until much later, when a therapist asked me to draw him, and I did, and she said, "You made him a geometry." I shut off the lamp. For a few breaths, I let the dark settle to its level. City glow seeped in from the windows. The corners drank it, and the room took shape around the absences. I lay very still on the bed. I listened. I told myself to count, to follow my breathing, to imagine the teal paint of the kitchen in my old apartment, the way it seems to warm the mornings, the friends who have slept on my couch without being consumed. A soft scratch came from behind the headboard. Mouse, I thought, almost relieved to think it. Then, again from the corner by the door, click, a precise sound like fingernails on tile. The scratch, the click, the scratch. A pattern, because of course there had to be a pattern. My phone sat on the bedside table, screen face down. I picked it up and used the camera as a mirror in my hand, angling it toward the darkest corner, turning away so I wouldn't look directly. The screen showed a slightly grainy triangle of shadow, grain shifting, organizing. No, it was nothing. When I turned to look, the corner was exactly what a corner is. I slept a kind of sleep that doesn't really. A shallow blinking drift in which dreams grow like barnacles on the hull of consciousness and fall off as soon as you try to name them. Once the bed trembled faintly as if a truck rumbled past. Once the hum under the building climbed half a note and held it until the hair on my arms prickled. When I woke for good, if for good is the right phrase, my mouth tasted like pennies. Breakfast, a shower, emails. In daylight, the corners were tame. Birds argued on the power lines. The hum sounded like a contented machine. I walked, found coffee, watched a woman in a yellow coat let her greyhound drink from a bottle cap. Back at the loft, I told myself last night had been nerves. I wrote a page and a half of something that wanted to be an essay about repetition. At noon, something shattered. The sound rang like a thrown plate, and I leaped up, heart-pitching, but nothing had fallen. The shiver of the sound remained, vibrating the air, and then settled into the building's steady tone. I stood with the useless adrenaline buzzing and laughed in a brittle way at myself. When I sat down, my chair had inched toward the far corner. Just a fraction. Enough to make my heel scrape the rug. By late afternoon, the light those corners drank was back in their throats. The room kept its clean edges until you looked too long. Then the angles fluttered, flexed, breathed. I dragged the lampstands into each corner, crowding them with light. The bulbs made small glass suns folding their rays across plaster. I didn't like the way the lampshades bulged inward, a little, as if the corners were leaning back. Okay, a new experiment. I went to the kitchenette and found chalk at the back of a drawer with the dish sponges. Someone had used it to mark a waterline on the washing machine. I drew thick white bars across each corner, silly ceremonial X's, a child's barricade. Then I took a blanket and hung it over a shelf so that one corner dissolved into a curve. It made the room ridiculous, and for a time, safe. The safety lasted until the chalk began to weep. It didn't smear. It thinned at the edges and slid downward in narrow, bright threads, as if the corners had warmed and the lines were sweating. I stared at the long white tears for a long time before I reached out to touch. My fingertip came away gritty, a line of powder trailing back and up into the blank angle where even shadow was tidy. "Enough," I told the empty room. "Enough." The room answered with a sound I recognized without wanting to. A small, deliberate double click from the door corner. Close to the floor it came again, then a third, higher, near the ceiling. The clicks mapped a slow approach, a halting, and a tension. My mouth dried so completely that my tongue nearly stuck to my teeth. "Not tonight," I said. "Not again. I'm not a kid anymore." A whisper rose, and for a moment, God help me, I thought it was the lamp's filament, stretched somehow into voice. It strained in the corner, voice abrading against angle. "No, more." The part of me that had been 7 years old took the next breath, and not the rest of me. My vision narrowed. I took a step toward the nearest corner, then another, and something leaned toward me from inside the angle. It didn't cross out, not a hand, not a face. It pushed the idea of a face forward along two hard planes, like a face making itself out of insistence. I smelled cold dust, that basement sack smell of things stored and left to learn patience. Behind it came a smell like cold metal and rain, the scent of the old switchboard hallways I had walked through earlier. "Who are you?" I asked. My voice reached, hit the corner, and came back grated. It felt as if words didn't like to travel into that shape. "No more." The whisper came again, shredded by angles. "Middle." "What?" The corner's shadow grew deeper, as if someone on the other side had taken one step closer. The clicks came fast now, a little impatient, clicking from floor, ceiling, knees. Yes, knees. The memory betrayed me with its terrible accuracy, then stopped so suddenly that the hum leapt into their place. My hands shook. I felt for my phone and opened the flashlight, the thin slice of hard light. When I held it toward the corner, the beam bent, not like an ordinary scattering, but a kink, a deviation, as if the light itself disliked the route. The shape inside the corner threw nothing to the walls. The corner drank everything. "Get out," I tried, and the word hit the angle and broke. "Get out," the whisper echoed, and for the first time I understood. It was not telling me to go. It was telling me to move now, away from where I stood, away from the middle of the room, because behind me the air had gone unnaturally quiet. The hum was gone. The friendly city noise outside folded itself, turned its face, hid. I stepped sideways without glancing back, refusing the impulse to look across the wide, bright center of the room where nothing at all should be. Something exhaled there, the feeling of breath without the sound, a flattening, a wrongness like wrong grammar you can't parse fast enough not to be trapped by it. My skin tightened, a whole body pucker. I felt the space behind me thin, like someone had run a hot iron over it. "Corner," the whisper ground out. "Corner." I committed the primary sin of childhood, which is also the primary sin of adulthood. I looked. I turned and gazed full on at the center of the room, with all the confidence of someone who has relied on vision as a proof of reality. In the middle of the floor, the light had no place to land. The rug's weave went blank within a ragged circle. The wood beneath stopped being wood, became a color without texture. When I tried to focus, it slipped, either too shallow to hold or too deep, and where it touched the leg of a chair, the leg looked sketched in pencil, then erased, then almost not there. I stumbled backward until my heel jammed against the baseboard, and my hands flailed for the nearest angle as if it were a roadside rail. The corner accepted my fingers like a cold mouth. It touched the chair again, the thing from the middle, whatever it was, and this time the leg made not a sound when it disappeared into blankness. The chair listed, fell silently, and stopped, halfway between upright and flat. Vertigo salted my tongue. Not me, the corner shaped at last, each fragment of sound like shredded paper sliding. "Keep out." The lamps burned, but their light faltered near the middle. I brought the phone's beam up and squinted. The light bent, then slid back into true when I angled it along the wall. The reflected line drew a wedge, a bright geometry into the corner. When the beam touched the shape there, the man of angles, the childhood geometry of him, the dark stiffened. He recoiled, then pressed forward again, pushing more shadow into that shape as if stuffing a wound with cloth. The thing in the middle swelled. Lampshades creaked inward. My ears rang. The chalk tears on the wall trembled, then were gone. A clean white corner remained, and within it, a suggestion that the brick recessed even farther. The figure bent there took a half step, and his movement was like a hinge closing. I realized with the clarity you get when the room is on fire that the man in the corner, the nightmare that made me fear edges, made me sleep with the nightlight bleeding out every angle, had been planted like a doorstop. Not a predator, or not merely, a brace against an absence that preferred the middle and despised angles. The therapist had told me to draw him and then to draw him away. We had rounded the corners on paper. We'd made it easy for whatever this was to enter rooms where lines met. I'm ashamed to say I did not think. I did not weigh choices. I simply acted with the bruised wisdom of a child running back to the wardrobe they hid in for an hour to outlast a fight. I stepped into the corner. I let the cold brick kiss my shoulder blades and tucked myself into the angle as if falling into the negative of an embrace. He closed around me. Not arms, a set of relations. My body discovered itself as lengths and planes. My knees learned another direction. It hurt, then it did not. Then it hurt in a way that wasn't pain but recognition. I felt the phone slick in my palm, my hand a brisk angle gripping it. The light wandered as the beam bucked, then steadied, and with my other hand, not a hand now but a junction, I reached into the corner and gathered the shape to me. For a breath, I was both. Child who learned to wedge their back into safety, and adult who wanted to rationalize the blank. For a breath, I understood how to aim light not as a line but as a wedge. I lifted the phone and bounced the beam along the wall, caught it through a water glass on the table, refracted it into a hard, narrow slice. The angle man leaned with me, pushed me into better geometry, and together we drove that wedge of light into the room's center. The blank convulsed. It did not scream. The absence of sound sheared. For a second it compacted into something I could almost understand, a roiling coin of no depth. Then it bulged and pressed, and the lamps popped in soft bursts, 1, 2, 3, glass pearls collapsing in the heat. The darkness that fell after was not total, because the hall light outside the door breathed faintly under the threshold. The hum came back as if it had stood at attention all this time, waiting for its cue. The blank retreated like tide water leaving under a pier. I held the angle man as long as I could. He held me as long as he needed to. When I felt the room settle, when the rug's weave looked like itself again and the chair returned to its full set of 3 dimensions with a guilty thump, I loosened my grip. The corner let me go in stages, as if prying greedily and then thinking better of it. At the very end, when I was almost out, something cold pressed its face, or the idea of a face, against my temple and breathed one word through the place where words break. Watch. I slept again that night, if you can call it sleep, when one eye is open somewhere you can't name. In the morning I discovered the skin along my left shoulder was ridged in faint, precise lines. 2 converging pale rails, as if the corner had marked me. A map, a scar, a claim. When I raised my arm, it clicked sometimes. It wasn't painful. It was merely another kind of hinge. I didn't stay the rest of the 2 weeks. I didn't demand a refund either. I left the keys on the table with a note that said, "Thank you for the stay. Everything was fine," which is one of the 2 lies we learn to tell in houses that are not ours. Back home, I rounded everything I could. I put plants where walls met. I bought a round rug, round mirrors, a clever round table. Still, at night, the corners I could not soften watched me with their blank, patient throats. Sometimes, after midnight, a polite double click comes from the baseboard, and I feel my shoulder respond with a warm, almost familial ache. At those times, I stand in the doorway and look across the center of the room without looking, the way you learn to see an illusion without letting it own your focus. I keep a glass of water on the shelf, a small, ridiculous lighthouse. Twice since then, I've woken to the old silence, that clean subtraction of sound that announces the middle has arrived. Once in my apartment, once in a hotel in a city with too much glass. Both times I felt the draw, the tug toward that bright blank. Both times before I could move, before I could choose, the nearest corner changed its breath. It leaned toward me. It raised the clicks. And I, who at 7 learned the words for running and for hiding, and learned a 3rd word that doesn't exist in any dictionary, stepped calmly into the angle and opened my arms. If I am honest, I do not know what I invited in that night, or what I keep now. The mark on my shoulder aches in rain. My vision sometimes catches two angles where there should be one. In crowded rooms, the middle feels like a mouth. Children look past me in elevators and smile at something they know is there. Perhaps I am a plug. Perhaps I am a hinge. Perhaps I am, lonely as everyone is, glad to have a shape that fits me, even if it was born in fear. Last night, when the woman upstairs turned on a light for her insomniac infant, the ceiling brightened and the entire room flattened for a heartbeat. No hum, no sense of weight. From the darkest corner came the mildest sound. Click, click. The sound a patient thing makes to announce it hasn't left. I stood up, and my shoulder warmed. I didn't say the name I never say. I didn't switch on the lamp or check my phone or walk to the door. I did the only thing that felt, not right, exactly, but least wrong. I took one step into the dark, and then another, until the corner accepted me and we together watched the middle.